This week's ParSHa, ParShat Terumah, we now suddenly travel away from the wonderful dramatic narrative that we've been in so far. You can't really get that much better. We've had plagues, we've had slavery, emancipation, splitting of seas, receiving the 10 Commandments, and we kind of wait for bated breath as to what's going to come next, except now we're told to begin a building project. And this is where Bnei Israel are told, "Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham," make for me a tabernacle and I will dwell in your midst. Now, a building project is in many ways a great idea, and those people who were involved in our shul building project tell you it probably caused a lot of headaches, but in some ways it's a good thing for if you want a nation to bond and everybody to be busy and involved. It's a good next step. The question that we always ask ourselves, though, is that we have 4 parshiot, these 2, then we're going to have a week of a break in 2 weeks' time, which I'm going to mention in a moment, and then another 2 weeks, which are all dedicated to this Mishkan. Is it not enough to say, go have your building project, have a nice time, give us a few instructions, tell us about some of the major features? Instead, the Torah goes into the detail about the hooks and the tapestries and every single little bit. And for most of us, unless, we've got an architect's mother here who might say that, that he would come with a deep appreciation of these texts. But for most of us, ignoramuses, when it comes to, the building side of things, it's a difficult read through these weeks because it's lost that sense of meaning and drama, etc. So what I would like to do is try and look at our overarching question is essentially, what is the purpose of dedicating so much time to these parshiot? Secondly, I'd like to hone in on one specific issue which comes up this week, which seems to be central to the Mishkan. And that is, what was at the heart of the Mishkan? What is the main thing that's going to be housed right in the center? It's the thing at the end of last week's parsha. Moshe is going up the mountain in order to bring it down.
Torah.
The Torah, the tablets, right? They're going to be in the ark. The ark is going to be right in the middle of the Mishkan. That is the kind of the crown jewels, so to speak, that are going to be so carefully protected in the Tower of London. This is what the ark is going to be. It's a central feature. And yet we're given a very curious command. On top of the ark, there's going to be something called the kaporet, which is essentially the kind of top ceiling part of the ark. But above that, we're given a very curious instruction, which is to make 2 cherubs, cherub-like forms. I'm going to share my screen for a moment, just that you can see it inside. Bear with me. Okay. Can you see that, everybody? Hang on, if I minimize you, I can. Okay, here we go. So, sorry, let me put this side by side so you can see the English and the. Okay, sorry. Thought I had it all prepared and it's changed. Instead of having the Hebrew and the English one next to the other, it's got the one on top of the other. Okay, let's go from here. I'm going to share the English for now, and then we'll hopefully dive into a little bit of Hebrew later. Okay, here we have the command. Make 2 cherubs of gold. Make them of hammered work. So it was 1 piece of gold. They had to be of gold. They weren't made 1 cherub and another cherub, but rather they were all part of the same piece of gold at the 2 ends of the cover. Make 1 cherub at one end and the other cherub at the other end of 1 piece with the cover. So you make the cherubim at its 2 ends. And then they had wings. The cherubim shall have their wings spread out above, shielding the cover with their wings. They shall confront each other, the faces of the cherubs being turned towards the cover. place the cover on top of the ark after depositing inside the ark the pact that I will give you. It sounds much more complicated in English. There, and this is the key part. This is really the climax. We've now read through all about how they need to build the ark, they need to build the kapara on top of the ark, and now they need to build the cherubim. And now comes the key message. There I will meet with you, and I will impart to you from above the cover, from between the two cherubs that are on top of the ark of the pact, all that I will command you concerning the Israelite people. So this is telling us that there's something epic about these cherubs, that the whole Mishkan, which is all about Hashem being able to dwell amongst the people and speak with the people, where's all of that going to come from? From between the two cherubim. Now I have a question, and some of you may share this question. We just received the 10 commandments. What was the second of the 10 commandments? The first is Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzitichem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God. Have one God. And what's the second one? Lo yeh lecha Elohim achirim al panai. Do not have any other gods. Don't have anything that could be construed as idol worship. And the laws of idol worship are, significant. So we say not only should you not serve an idol, but you also shouldn't make an idol, because if you make the idol, especially in those days, what's going to happen? You come to bow to the idol, then you come to serve the idol. It's one big slippery slope. And what are we going to see already in 2 weeks' time? What do the Jewish people do? They have the golden calf. So the minute there's something physical and tangible, which by the way, as human beings, we always crave after something. To talk about an abstract God, to talk to an abstract God is something very difficult. And therefore, always over history, we always look for something tangible to connect to. And yet, having something tangible is very dangerous. That's why there's a problem with idol worship. And in fact, that's what the Maimonides said was how pagan worship developed, that in the beginning, people didn't worship the sun. They used the sun as a conduit to say, look at what God created. But what happened over time? That you start to worship the sun itself. So over here, there's a huge danger that you're saying at the center of your ark, you should essentially erect 2 statues which are of human form. And that could be a slippery, slippery slope. And indeed, Christian theology has taken the concept of the cherubs to a certain place, which one could say there's a danger there all along of it becoming that. And so we have this question. Why do we have cherubs at the heart of the tabernacle? What were they? And what's their significance? Now, Rabbeinu Bachai, who lived in the 12th century in Spain, says, the fact that God was the one who says no idol worship, he basically comes along and says, there's one exception, you can have cherubs. You're not worshiping them. Normally, I wouldn't allow you to have any statues, but in this instance, in the Mishkan, I want you to have cherubs. And that's why it's okay. It's a Talmudic phrase that we say, ParSHa asar, the mouth that said something was forbidden, ParSHa shehitir. It's the same mouth that then can come along and say it's okay, right? That's one of the reasons, by the way, with something like second day Yom Tov. It will take the same kind of court that made the decree about it to come and undo that decree. So it's a concept that's used in many places in the Talmud. And Rabbeinu Bachai applies it here to say this was a special exception that God's making to say normally having something like cherubs would be totally forbidden. But just over here on top of the ark, God wants you to have them. But that makes our question even stronger. If an exception is being made to allow cherubs, there must be something pretty significant about what the cherubs convey to us and how important they are to what the Mishkan as a whole was trying to achieve. With me on the question? Okay, so first of all, let's stop and let's look at what were these cherubs. And there are various different interpretations. Then we're going to try and plug this back in to their significance in the Mishkan. And then we'll go macro again and try and look at the significance of the Mishkan as a whole especially to our lives today, where, the Mishkan is an ideal rather than something that's in our lives. So in terms of what these cherubs were, we're given a few clues from the Torah itself. We know that they're made of gold, and we know that they had wings, and we know that they had faces, and that's all. Now we pick up a few more clues because they also had cherubs in King Solomon's temple, but we don't know very much. I'm going to give 4 different opinions, and I think that each one of these opinions, they all kind of coexist, and I think that each one brings out a different dimension in our relationship with God. The first and perhaps most famous one is that the cherubs were a man and a woman. And in fact, in the days of King Solomon's temple, the Talmud says that when people used to come to visit on Pesach and on Shavuot and on Sukkot, whenever they would come, they would actually open up the curtain where these keruvim were. Now, by the way, in King Solomon's temple, they didn't have the keruvim on top of the ark. They had them, they were like massive, they was probably the size of a child, each one, and they took up most of the room themselves, and they were sort of self-standing statues almost, instead of being on top of the ark. Anyway, that's perhaps a story for a different day, but you can imagine it's a powerful scene. If you're going to visit Jerusalem and the temple for Yom Tov, and you come and suddenly the curtain is pulled back, and they would see the form of a male and a female essentially in an intimate position. And this was the image they wanted people to take back home with them. Why? I think we've spoken about this before, that we speak about God in many ways, as our parent, as our teacher, as our king. And here it's the form of having a male and a female, reminding us that it's a relationship like the passionate, demanding relationship of two, a spousal relationship, a love relationship. And when we recouch, reframe thinking of God in those terms, it suddenly demands a lot of us. And so this was what they wanted people to take home with them, was don't think of yourselves as the child who'll always be loved wherever you go. Think of yourselves as the lifelong partner, the partner that is madly in love, that knows that there are things that are demanded of them in a relationship, responsibilities, privileges, and this was demonstrated through the embrace of the keruvim and by having them male and female. By the way, there are many who also say the fact that you had one male and one female made out of the same piece of gold is also showing the significance of the equality of having man and woman both there present on top of the ark. The second is that, and by the way, these are not mutually exclusive, because it's probable that one was male and one was female, but the faces were the faces of children. And this is because the word keruvim is a strange word. We don't have it in many places. And it seems to come from the root of something that's to do, it's worked out in the Talmud from a child. And it's sort of derived in, it's with a bit of poetic license, but it seems that these cherubs had the faces of children, which is often how you'll see them depicted in art forms. Why did they have the faces of children?
Innocence.
Innocence.
Purity.
Purity. Freshness. We were having this discussion around our supper table, and I was saying, it's that energy and the idealism of children, and my kids were like, huh? I guess you don't realize it until you sort of pass that stage, right? The power of youth. But again, coming back to a different dimension of our relationship with God, that yes, we want to invoke this feeling of mutual engagement, reciprocity, love of the husband and the wife, which is demonstrated between the male and the female. But we don't only want to speak of our relationship with God like that. We also see God as our ultimate parent. And however old and tired or, you know, whatever, tainted, I'm using all the opposites of the words you've brought, adulthood may have brought, we ultimately are still the children of God. And of course, that comes with a sense of unconditional love, which is different to the relationship of the husband and the wife, where it demands something from both parts. So this is a different aspect of our relationship with God, which is being hinted at through the fact that the cherubs have these faces of children. But then there's another opinion which says that one cherub had the face of a child. The other cherub had the face of an adult.
What?
An adult. One was an older person, one was a younger person. Why would it have been demonstrated in this way? Anyone?
It's a two-way relationship.
It's
We
a
learn and grow.
Say that again. We love and grow.
We learn and grow, so that it's a give and take.
Absolutely. There's the feeling of generational, you know, from one generation to the next, the old and the young existing together. There's also the relationship of the teacher and the pupil. And ultimately, we also are looking to God as being almost like, you know, the teacher. And the other thing is, and this is a more Kabbalistic idea, is that when a teacher has to convey something, they have a certain thing in their mind. You know, when you meet one of those very brilliant university professors, now they've got an encyclopedic knowledge on their topic. But if they just mind drop everything they know on the topic, it's not going to mean anything to me, because as a layman, it will almost fall on deaf ears. It will go over my head. What they need to be able to do is to break their subject down. The great teacher is not the one who knows so much. It's the one who is able to convey it in a digestible way for their students. And therefore, by hinting at this relationship of teacher and student, we're actually being shown that through these keruvim, through the Mishkan, that is almost our gateway. We'll never understand. The student won't suddenly have access to his teacher's encyclopedic knowledge, but he will have some sort of a gateway into his teacher's trail of thought. So too with God. We'll never totally fathom God, but through certain access points, we have a gateway into an understanding. And the fourth way of understanding the keruvim is actually a much more kind of textual, what we would call the real pshat. And this is brought by the grandson of Rashi, the Rashbam, who didn't feel the need to always reconcile himself with the teachings of the sages, but really just look at the text and what makes sense. What's the one thing we know about the keruvim? They had wings. And we see it in certain other places, like in Ezekiel, in Psalms, about God, somebody flying on the wings of the keruvim. So it would make sense to say that the keruvim was some sort of winged being, a bird. Now, it's less glamorous, perhaps, to see it in this way, but I bring it not only because it's a reading that seems to be very close to the text, but actually I think it's a beautiful image, because it denotes that of flying from one world to the next, of being able to fly away from the place where I am stuck into a totally different space. And perhaps that is what the Mishkan was about. And the keruvim, as the place through which God would speak to the people, is essentially the way that we are able to fly from one place, from earth to heaven, and how heaven connects with earth. So these four different opinions, the one that it's like a male and a female, and that passionate, loving relationship, the one that they had the faces of children, the innocence, the freshness, our relationship with God as a parent, and unconditional love, the teacher and the student, the one having an adult face, like the Rebbe, you know, teaching the young child who's the other one of the keruvim, the relationship we have with God as our teacher, and the way that we can connect through they could have connected through the Mishkan. And the fourth being that of the bird, the freedom to fly, the ability to be transported from one space to the next. All of these offer us an understanding as to what the Kruvim were and why it was so important that there was an exception to say, just here, have some kind of a form, because by having this form, you can understand the way that you can connect with God over here in the Mishkan. But I want to add one piece to our puzzle, and that is that there is one mention of Kruvim before now in the Torah. And that is right at the beginning of the Torah. Does anybody recall? It's in ParSHa Bereshit, right at the very beginning, just after Adam and Eve are sent away from the Garden of Eden. I'm going to share it with you because it's actually quite amazing when you see it inside, and you'll suddenly recall it as well. Can you see that? So, Vishalchehu Hashem Elokim megan Eden, and God sent Adam out of the Garden of Eden, la'avod et ha'adama, to work the land, asher lukach musham, that he had been taken from there. V'yigaresh et ha'adam, and he sent him away, v'yashken mikedem legan Eden, and he put to the east of the Garden of Eden et ha'kruvim, some cherubs, ve'et lahat ha'cherev ha'mitapechet, and a revolving sword, lishmar et derech et ha'chaim, to guard the path to the tree of life and immortality. I'm convinced that J.K. Rowling must have got an idea or two from this passage, but who knows? So over here, we see that the cherubs are put to guard the path to the Garden of Eden. They're not in the Garden of Eden. You'll also note we don't normally, the word to put is not normally v'yashken. What does v'yashken remind us of? Mishkan, right? That's our ParSHa this week. So to understand the role of Kruvim, we actually need to go back to the first Kruvim, to these first cherubs that were put outside of the Garden of Eden to guard the path to the tree of life after Adam and Eve were already sent out of the garden. Now, what seems to you to be the role of these cherubs?
They're guardians.
Right? They seem to be guardians of some kind. And interesting, what are they guarding? It doesn't say they were preventing entry to the Garden of Eden. Their role was very specific. They were guarding the path to the tree of life, to the Etz HaChaim. Well, what do we say in our prayers today?
Etz Chaim.
Etz Chaim hi lemachaziktim ba. It is a tree of life for those who hold onto it. What are we referring to?
The Torah.
The Torah. We speak of the Torah today as our tree of life. What seems to be happening here in our ParSHa, in ParShat Terumah, is we're almost going back full circle at the very beginning of the creation of the world. There were guardians that were put in place so we couldn't get to a place that could have almost been dangerous for us, right? To the tree of life. Now we're being told you have a different type of a tree of life. It's the Torah. There are also going to be guardians there. This relationship is a powerful relationship. It's an inspirational relationship. It's an epic relationship. It's a relationship that will travel with you everywhere, but it also has dangers. It was only once a year, in one time, in one place, and one person who was ever allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. And that was, of course, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And we know, of course, that fact that Aaron's sons died by going in there a different time. There are dangers. One can be drawn to something, but actually having guardians is something that almost shows us its power and its beauty. And therefore, when we come back here, we see perhaps why not only did we need cherubs for us to understand what is the purpose of us coming to the Mishkan, what is the purpose of God speaking to us from the Mishkan. It's almost a little bit like a filter that we're being drawn to appreciate our relationship with God, and how sometimes we relate to God as our parent, sometimes as our teacher, sometimes we look to God as our partner, and sometimes we feel very stuck. And when we look at the image of the cherubs and we see them as birds, it gives us the ability to be here and yet somehow to also be transported. Finally, as seeing as our time is running out, I want to speak about why now? Why now in Jewish history do we switch focus to start to talk about this building and all the details of everything that's going into it with the cherubs at its center? Once again, Rabbeinu Bachaye very beautifully breaks down every single vessel that was in the temple and says that each vessel represented something else in the Jewish people. So, for example, the ark represented the scholars and the righteous people. The cherubs, he believes, represented the angels. The kaporet represented another form of the leaders. The table represented the kings of the people. The altar represented Joe Blogs on the street, the regular people. And in so doing, I feel that post Mount Sinai, there was a danger that people could turn around and they could say, wow, we had an amazing experience, but I don't touch it anymore. I don't feel that anymore. It was a one-off. Now Moses, he's gone up the mountain and the elders are privy. They're still feeling the inspiration, but that's because they're the rabbis. That's because they're the priests. They're involved in something. But for us, we're just feeling a little bit cold and apathetic. The imagery of the Mishkan is almost like a puzzle. Without one vessel, it's not complete. And the particular vessel that's going to be used the most will be the altar that represents the Jewish people. That was where really all the action took place. So yes, you need your menorah and you need your cherubs and you need all these great up things, but every single piece is important. And in so doing, in a very subtle way, not only are the people utilizing their skills as they come to the building project, but through the actual architecture and by detailing exactly how the vessels work, everybody is being told, you have a role to play. Never think that your role is less important than anybody else's. You might not be the priest, you might not be the king, but you are an integral part of the puzzle. And finally, and I think that this is really, for us, of course, we say, Va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, make me a temple and I will dwell in them. In them, in the plural, was God saying, I will dwell in every single one of you. And I always wondered to myself, we generally say the shul replaced the temple. The shul is our mini mikdash. Only this year did I understand why the sages didn't say, actually, it's referring to shuls. In the absence of a temple, it's been replaced by the shul, but they said God resides in every individual. Because suddenly this year, we have had to become our own temples. Our homes have had to become our hubs, our own spiritual connectivity. We've had nothing else. And so actually, perhaps for this year, the relevance of looking at a story of yesteryear, of the architecture and the buildings and the vessels, in a certain way, the imagery has never been more powerful than this year when we've actually realized our own capability and our own power. Wishing you all a wonderful week, and we will continue looking at the fabulous building project next week.